Alrighty, we're just opening things up here. Takes a few seconds for folks to connect with us. So as they do so, I will say good afternoon on behalf of Fourth Space. Welcome and great to see you all here. Welcome to this afternoon's panel featuring two Concordia researchers discussing issues concerning the transitions necessary to meet climate targets, a discussion that will also focus on the challenges of and potential alternatives to the current capitalist system. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, I'll just say a few words about Concordia's Fourth Space. We are located in downtown Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, on unceded Indigenous land. We are a physical space on campus whereby we collaborate with our community to make research initiatives and course activities accessible to all through interactive experiences. We're currently recording this session and we are live streaming at CU Fourth Space. I'll put the links in the chat for those of you who want to share on your own feeds. You're more than welcome to join in the conversation today by sharing any thoughts or comments in the chat throughout. And we urge you to use the panelists and attendees option when you do so, so that everybody can see your comment. If you have questions, a burning question for each of the presenters today, there'll be a question period following each of the presentations. We invite you to pop that question into the Q&A, just making our moderators' life a little bit easier as the place to keep their eye on for questions. Or if you prefer to speak, no problem, just raise your little virtual hand and we will unmute you and give you the possibility to use your voice to ask the question. Okay, on that note, it's my pleasure to pass the floor over to Amy Petit. Over to you, Amy. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Anna. It's a pleasure, a real pleasure to be here today to introduce this session of our week-long series on sustainability in the climate crisis. So today we have two speakers. The first is going to be Anders Bjorn, who is a postdoctoral fellow working with Damon Matthews and Shannon Lloyd, associated with the JMSB. The title I have for the talk is From the Paris Agreement to Corporate Climate Commitments, Evaluation of 7 Methods for Setting Science-Based Emission Targets. That will be followed by a presentation by Daniel Horen Greenford, who is a doctoral student working with Damon Matthews. And the presentation title that I have for that one is From Cynical Pessimism to Constructive Creativity, How to Overcome Capitalist Realism and Save the Climate, which is something we all hope we can do. So we'll go in that sequence. We'll start with Anders. So Anders, it's over to you.
Thank you, Amy, and welcome everyone. I'm just gonna share my screen. All right, so I'll get going. And as Amy mentioned, the title of my presentation is From the Paris Agreement to Corporate Climate Commitments, an evaluation of 7 methods for setting science-based emission targets. And it's based on a paper that was recently accepted by the journal Environmental Research Letters. It's online for everyone to see, open access as well. So the Science-Based Targets initiative was established in 2015, right around the same time as the Paris Agreement, and it's a collaboration of some big players in the kind of non-governmental organization world and consultancy world. A science-based targets is by this initiative defined as being in line with what the latest climate science says is necessary to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. To give you a couple of examples of approved targets, the Coca-Cola has a target where they want to reduce their absolute scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions by 25% by the year 2030 compared to the year 2015. For those of you that are not so familiar with these accounting terms, scope 1 is basically all the direct emissions of facilities of vehicles that a company owns. Scope 2 is then the emissions associated with its electricity use, or could also be heat or cooling if it receives that from another provider. Scope 3 is everything else in the life cycle. So it's the emissions associated with the suppliers producing the stuff that is bought by the company, as well as emissions associated with use and disposal of the products. Another example is this: it's a Portuguese electricity provider, and they have a target to reduce their scope 1 and 2 emissions 90%, and this is per terawatt hour produced. So it's not on an absolute basis; it's on an intensity basis by 2030 compared to 2015. So this is just to give you an idea of what those targets might look like. It's really a practice that is growing fast. In 2015, when they started out, only like a handful of companies were setting targets. But now by 2020, we have more than 500 companies that have set a science-based target and had a target approved by this science-based target initiative. And another virtually 500 companies have committed to setting a target within the next year or so. And those 500 companies that have already set a target, their current emissions, if you add them all up, are a little less than 4% of global emissions from energy and industry. And this is nearly twice the territorial emissions of Canada. So as you can imagine, there are some quite big companies amongst those 500. The purpose of our study is well, first of all, we noticed that there are 7 different methods for setting science-based targets. So for breaking down a global carbon budget to a company level, but many of these methods are not really documented well. And so because of that, it's a bit unclear what the differences between them are. And that means it's difficult for companies to make informed choices of methods. And it's also difficult for the stakeholders of companies. So that could be their customers or their investors or policymakers to understand the sort of the implications of choosing one method over another. And on top of that, it's also not clear why the Science-Based Target Initiative recommends some methods and not other methods. So there's a lot of intransparency, and therefore we wanted with this study to characterize and compare the 7 methods through a simulation. And so just to give you kind of a conceptual look at the simulation, we imagine that we're in a world where there are just eight companies. So everything produced in this world is produced by 8 companies, and they are archetype companies. So they represent certain kind of typical characteristics, and in this case, it's a combination of 3 dimensions. So how fast they are expected to grow their production every year. That's the first dimension. The second dimension is the baseline emission intensity. So this could be in the units of grams of CO2 per dollar of revenue or dollar of value added. And finally, whether they're located in developed or developing regions, and whether they are in a sector where it's cheap or expensive to reduce emissions. So this is the simulation that we designed for the purpose of this study. And we're only considering scope 1 emissions for individual companies because the scope 2 emission of one company is the scope 1 emission of another company. So in order not to double count, we didn't consider scope 2 and 3 here. And we came up with a framework to try to really understand what is it that makes these methods different from each other. And so we found that there are sort of 2 primary characteristics, and based on those, you can derive 3 additional characteristics. And so the first one is the target equation. That's really where you calculate how you can go from global emissions to a company level. And in order for that target equation to work, it needs a bunch of parameters that it gets from a global scenario, which involves, amongst other things, a global emission pathway for how emissions can be reduced from the current level to something near 0 and even negative. And so that that corresponds to the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement. And then that means the target equation and the global scenario means that a certain set of company variables are required, such as the emission level in the baseline year, also the choice of baseline year, an expectation of how much the company will increase its production in the future, whether the company is located in a developed or developing country, and the sector that the company belongs to, just to mention a few. Then there's the allocation principle. That's basically some sort of normative principle for translating a global scarce resource, in this case the global carbon budget, into a sort of a fair share for individual companies. And then finally, there are some application constraints. For example, some methods don't work for certain sectors and certain types of greenhouse gases, and it could also be that they only cover a certain amount of years because of the constraints in the global scenario. So this is kind of a useful way to understand what are the sort of the bits and pieces of the methods, and how do they then differentiate between each other. So the allocation principle, how important is it? I'm going to use that question to sort of show also differences between the targets that the companies will receive when using the individual methods. So now we have those 8 archetypical companies represented as time series in this chart. But and on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you have the emissions relative to the baseline year emissions. So starting in 100% and going down to something smaller towards the year 2050. As you can see with the first method that we're presenting here, it doesn't matter what the characteristics of the company is. They will follow the exact same emission pathway. So that's where the principle grandfathering is used, and no other principles are used. Then complicating things a bit more, if you also add the principle of economic value added, you see that there are sort of 2 clusters of target pathways representing companies that are expected to grow fast versus not so fast. So the more you are expected to grow, the less you kind of have to reduce your absolute emissions in the future under this principle. If we take the third method that we looked at, in addition to those 2 principles, it also looked at responsibility, meaning that the historic responsibilities of companies located in developed countries means that they need to reduce faster than companies located in developing countries. And finally, the most sort of complicated method we looked at that takes a bunch of other parameters, other principles into account. I don't have time to go into details with all of them, but you see, using this method, you really sort of differentiate between the companies based on those 3 dimensions of characteristics that I outlined before. And you can even see that one of the companies are actually allowed to emit a little bit more in the future than it emits today. But this is not to say that this is a very common result to have when you have a bunch of actual companies that you apply the targets on. We also looked into what if all companies sort of cherry pick the easiest target, because you can imagine that a company could try to calculate a science-based target using those 7 different methods, and then kind of comparing the targets and then saying, well, why not pick the easiest one if it can get us that nice little certificate of having a science-based target? So we tried to see what would happen if each company picked the easiest target, and then what you see is that the black pathway, that's the global greenhouse gas budget, so to say, it's being overshot by the company. So even if all companies are to meet their targets, the fact that they sort of cherry pick it leads to an overshoot situation. But the science-based target, I should say, the science-based target initiative have some measures in place for avoiding that this is happening. So they encourage companies not to cherry pick the easiest target and actually do the opposite, cherry pick the hardest targets amongst a bunch of alternatives. Implications of our study. Well, we recommend a bunch of things to the Science Based Targets initiative. First of all, we think that they should use our characterization of methods to present methods in a more systematic and comparable way in their sort of target guideline material on their website. And also they should really disclose the underlying reasons for why they recommend some methods over others. And finally, we think it's important that they require transparency from companies on the calculations of science-based targets, because if you look at the way companies communicate their targets, 95% of the cases, they just communicate the target itself. They don't say anything about how it was calculated. They don't even mention the method used for calculating it. So that means that as an observer, you don't actually know, for example, what the allocation principle that went into the target setting. And our study got a bit of media attention. It became part of a bigger conversation around how there's perhaps there's need for more transparency within the Science Based Targets initiative, and also from the companies setting targets. So that was kind of interesting. Now, to sort of present a segue to Daniel's presentation, here are some questions that you can perhaps try to ask yourselves. First of all, what role should companies play in climate governance? Companies relative to governments and other actors, what role should be played by companies? Are voluntary actions by companies sufficient for meeting climate targets? The Science Based Targets initiative is completely voluntary. There's no one forcing you to join. Is an initiative like that sufficient for meeting climate targets? Can we just focus on the production side? And in other words, are there no need to intervene on the demand side and to address inequalities in consumption? Also, can we reduce emissions sufficiently rapidly within a capitalist system? All the methods I look at, they assume that global gross domestic product will continue to increase, sort of following its historical trends. And can we, within that scenario where we increase global output at a compound rate every year, can we really reduce emissions fast enough? If the answer is no, do we have time to replace a capitalist system with something else? Keeping in mind that we need to reduce global emissions by around 50% in just 9 years from now. That was my presentation. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you very much, Anders. So Danielle, we'll turn things over to you. Yes, there you go.
Sorry.
Sorry, did you say that I should present now, or are we going to have us?
Yes, it's your turn.
Okay, rather than do questions. Okay.
Well, I mean, I guess if there were clarification questions, but I think it's better if we collect and have some sort of exchange.
Sure.
That's my own feeling about it.
Just...
But I guess if there were any clarification questions.
Okay, that's fine.
Are there any?
We would leave time for some discussion after his, because the topics are different, but that's fine. I can start. So I just will share my screen. Share screen. All right. Can you see my cover slide?
Yes.
Great. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks, Anos. So this is a story about how we've come to believe capitalism is the only game in town. The most ardent supporters of capitalism say that it may not be perfect, but it's the best we have. As Mark Fisher has shown in his 2009 book, Capitalist Realism, Is There No Alternative? This kind of thinking is a self-fulfilling prophecy. and capitalism sustains itself by foreclosing on the ability to imagine another kind of future. Those who argue for creative alternatives to capitalism are condescended to and often portrayed as naive idealists. Even capitalism's most vocal critics are often resigned to this same cynical pessimism, and despite having a wealth of alternatives to offer, they can only see a future where capitalism reigns supreme, even if it destroys the world in the process. The left has become too comfortable with its own marginality and impotence, but that was in 2009. Since then, a lot has changed, and now progressive politics in the United States and the global climate and social justice movements are once again gaining steam. But the challenge remains. We need a viable alternative, otherwise the next revolution will fail to transform the world for the better. In this talk, I will argue how supposedly the most rational and unbiased minds, physical scientists, have been overcome by this pernicious thinking. In the climate world, it expresses itself in our models of possible futures we define. These models are made with many presumptions and presuppositions. Most models presuppose economic growth. Most are limited by what is deemed politically practical or feasible. But this criteria of practicality and feasibility is suspended for technology. Instead of considering what fundamental changes we could make to how we live, these models opt for magical thinking, betting on technologies that are a long way from being scalable and possibly will never be economically or energetically practical. In this sense, it's easier for us to imagine the end of the world or some fantastical technological emancipation, like devoting an area of the land size of a subcontinent to carbon sequestration, than it is to imagine an alternative way of life. I present the following challenge. We must instead overcome capitalist realism so that we can free ourselves from its ideological straitjacket and imagine ways forward without being constrained by a set of rules that make solving the climate crisis impossible. The remainder of the talk will proceed as follows. We'll introduce Fisher's concept more thoroughly because I think it's an invaluable tool for liberating ourselves. I will expose how capitalist realism is inherent to climate and sustainability policy and review the evidence for why environmental sustainability and economic growth are contradictory goals. Then I will propose in a broad sense how this elucidates an internal contradiction in capitalism. And finally, I will argue that exposing this internal contradiction, or aporia, could be what's needed to break free of the cynical pessimism that pervades our society so that we can strive towards a better world. So I'd like to begin by showing you a clip from Adam Curtis's 2016 film Hypernormalization, which is a montage of films depicting the end of the world by natural and unnatural means. Oops. Apologies.
keep that flame burning. Yeah, you gotta keep that flame burning forever, baby.
Sorry, lost my video. Anyways, one sec. All right, sorry about that. Anyways, so what is capitalist realism? Capitalist realism is the sense that, so yeah, anyways, that montage, of course, is exactly what Fisher was getting at. And this kind of imagination of the end of the world that's so well articulated in Hollywood is fairly representative of the ideology that's within the general public mind. So capitalist realism is the sense that the only realistic or viable political economic system is the only realistic or viable political economic system. And this sentiment really took hold after the fall of the Soviet Union, and its widespread acceptance coincided with the rise of neoliberalism. Capitalist realism is epitomized best by the slogan, "It is easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism." Fisher says, the slogan captures precisely what I mean by capitalist realism, the widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but that is also impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. The success of capitalist realism is that it has made capitalism the only game in town. And that, I argue, applies equally to its proponents as well as to its critics, who, while opposing it, still see the alternative proposals as marginal counter-narratives to capitalism that will likely persevere despite their best efforts. Capitalism realism is not Fisher's original coinage. It was employed in a more limited way as a parody of socialist realism by pop artists in the 1960s. But Fisher's version, and I quote, is more expansive. It's a pervasive atmosphere conditioning not only the production of culture, but also the regulation of work and education, and acting as a kind of invisible barrier constraining thought and action. Paraphrasing would do injustice to Fisher's thoughts here, so I'll quote a bit more from the third chapter. Capitalism and the Real. If capitalism realism were so seamless, and if current forms of resistance are so hopeless and impotent, where can an effective change come from? A moral critique of capitalism, emphasizing the ways in which it leads to suffering, only reinforces capitalist realism. Poverty, famine, and war can be presented as an inevitable part of reality, while the hope that these forms of suffering could be eliminated easily painted as naive utopianism. Capitalist realism can only be threatened if it is shown in some way to be inconsistent or untenable, if that is to say capitalism's ostensible realism turns out to be nothing of the sort. Now, that last bit is where the hope in Fisher's diagnosis lies. I'll continue quoting from the start of chapter 3, since this is crucial. In his words, he says, needless to say, what counts as realistic, what seems possible at any point in the social field, is defined by a series of political determinations. An ideological position can never be really successful until it is naturalized, and it cannot be naturalized while it is still thought of as a value rather than a fact. Accordingly, neoliberalism has sought to eliminate the very category of value in the ethical sense. Over the past 30 years, capitalist realism has successfully installed a business ontology, in which it is simply obvious that everything in society, including healthcare and education, should be run as a business. When I first read this, I was astounded because he had articulated what has irked ecological economists for decades, most of whom lack the political perspective to phrase it so clearly. And let me be clear here, I'm not here to indict or reprimand colleagues for lacking political perspective. I've also been heartened by how excited many of my colleagues have been in incorporating a more holistic perspective and how far the field has come in recent years. And so I just want to give a little example, but not spend too much time on this. But I think it's important to just look at some basic presumptions in, for example, the climate modeling that shows transition pathways. So here we have the four categories that have been presented in the special report, warming on 1.5 degrees by the IPCC. And so you can see here that once the P3 scenario with limited overshoot has CO2 emissions that have to be removed through bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is when you grow crops, then use the crops as a fuel to generate electricity, then you sequester the carbon dioxide that they generate with CCS technology. So the amount that you're actually relying on in this pathway is about 16 gigatons per year by 2100, which is 1.6 times China's present emissions, and it would use up. You'd have to occupy an area of land the size of India, and an even more, a more technologically optimistic and implausible scenario would be those with overshoot, where you go well above 1.5 and have to bring it back down, and it would require about 20 gigatons by 2050 of emissions being reduced by BCCS, and that would use a land area just shy of the size of Australia. And so there's been a lot of talk about limits to growth for many decades, but and for a lot of people, the Limits to Growth report was their introduction to this. And it was very, very, very famous, and there's been a 30-year update, which is definitely built on some of the shortcomings of the original model. But it really doesn't seem to have made a big dent in the thinking of policymakers today. As Herman Daly, who was one of the founding scholars of ecological economics and a former World Bank senior economist, said, not everything bears repetition, but truth does, especially when that truth is being both denied by entrenched interests and verified by new information. And this, of course, certainly applies to that. And that quote was included in the Limits to Growth 30-year update. And just briefly to show you just the trends. So here we have growing CO2 emissions and growing GDP at a CO2 emissions growing similarly, but of course less pronounced, but still very closely coupled to GDP. The same data shown, but plotted as a scatter. And you can see there's an extremely strong correlation with no decoupling of the sort needed to actually make green growth a possibility. Same applies for material. This material use includes fossil fuels, but other physical material inputs. And pretty much when you include all their materials using the material footprint metric, you see that there's been pretty much an entire in-step coupling of material use and GDP. And so, but you might say, but what if there's some sort of crazy technological innovation that we can't see that's totally historically unprecedented? Even so, if you still presuppose economic growth maintaining an exponential curve, that innovation will quickly be canceled out and overcome, dominated by this growth trend. So even here with unrealistic, as you can see, the lines here show, the top line shows more plausible, and the lower green line shows a highly implausible rate of technological innovation. This is for Australia. You would still have, even with the initial decline in resource use, it would plateau and then go back up, tracking economic growth. So in chapter 3, Capitalism the Real, Mark Fisher articulates the crucial point at the heart of social change. What is possible, at least in the social realm, is indeed a collective choice. And what is natural is also a matter, quote unquote natural, is also a matter of what people decide collectively and agree with or accept as such. So again, I think it's worth reading an excerpt. So here he says, emancipatory politics must always destroy the appearance of a natural order, must reveal what is presented as necessary and inevitable to be a mere contingency, just as it must make what was previously deemed to be impossible seem attainable. It is worth recalling that what is currently realistic was itself once called impossible. The slew of privatizations that took place since the 1980s would have been unthinkable only a decade earlier, and the current political economic landscape, with unions in abeyance, utilities and railways denationalized, he's speaking from the UK, could scarcely have been imagined in 1975. Conversely, what was once eminently possible is now deemed unrealistic. In brief, Fisher reminds us that no position is post-ideological, but the victory of neoliberalism has been to establish itself as this natural order, and as an apolitical and ideological free or objective perspective. And as Marxist scholar David Harvey once said, the claim to be free of ideology is itself an ideological claim. And at this point, Fisher introduces the concept of the real, and I quote, which is a Lacanian concept here. So for Lacan, the real is what any reality must suppress. Indeed, reality constitutes itself through just this repression. The real is an unrepresentable X, a traumatic void that can only be glimpsed in the fractures and inconsistencies in the field of apparent reality. So one strategy against capitalist realism could involve invoking the real's underlying reality that capitalism presents to us. So in simple terms, he's referring to something that you get evidence that shows an internal contradiction and it shatters your world. So our worlds have been shattered in smaller ways on more personal levels many times throughout our life. And this process of renouncing an old view, now proven to be baseless, and revising it in favor of something based on new evidence is just part of maturing intellectually. There comes a time in most Western children's lives where they give up the belief in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy, and they learn that, in fact, it was their parents placing gifts under the tree or money under their pillows. Some even go as far as mocking this early belief, to gain a cool distance from their earlier ignorance, which they are now ashamed of. This destruction of an outmoded belief and the creation of a new, better informed one is what's needed now, but at a collective societal scale. And turning to the environmental crisis, Fisher says, and again I quote, "Environmental catastrophe is one such real. At one level, to be sure, it might look as if green issues are very far from being unrepresentable voids for capitalist culture. Climate change and the threat of resource depletion are not being repressed so much as incorporated into advertising and marketing. What this treatment of environmental catastrophe illustrates is the fantasy structure on which capitalist realism depends, a presupposition that resources are infinite, that the earth itself is merely a husk which capital can at a certain point slough off like a used skin, and that any problem can be solved by the market. The significance of green critiques is that they suggest that far from being the only viable political economic system, capitalism is in fact primed to destroy the entire human environment. The relationship between capitalism and eco-disaster is neither coincidental nor accidental. Capitalism's need of a constantly expanding market, its growth fetish, mean that capitalism is by its very nature opposed to any notion of sustainability." So Fisher's discussion of the environmental crisis as a real that threatens capitalist realism ends here, as he feels that there's been progress made in this forum, and he seems optimistic that it will continue. I have to say that I agree. Since the book's publication in 2009, we've seen only bigger and bolder challenges being leveled against capitalism, and more conviction in the voices that aim to expose the internal contradiction of capitalism, that a system that erodes the biophysical world is doomed to destroy itself. The economy, as any ecological economist will tell you, is embedded within the rest of the natural world, and economic sustainability is predicated upon environmental sustainability. Of course, you can't have an economy on a dead planet.
Oh my God, please God, oh my God. Oh my God, please keep the horses safe, please God, please. Look at this tunnel. Oh my God. Oh my God.
So this clip of a woman driving through a California wildfire trying to escape for her life is actually used as an opening scene in Adam Curtis's latest series, Can't Get You Out of My Head, An Emotional History of the Modern World. And this kind of emotional narrative is something climate communications is growing to embrace. And we know that you can't attribute a causal relationship to an extreme event like a wildfire to global heating, but you can attribute it statistically. There needs to be a way to communicate this effectively at a visceral and effective level while not sacrificing scientific integrity. And I think we're getting better at this. And so Fisher concludes, and I quote, "Nothing contradicts capitalism's constitutive imperative towards growth more than the concept of rationing goods and resources. Yet it is becoming uncomfortably clear that consumer self-regulation in the market will not by themselves avert environmental catastrophe. In any case, rationing of some sort is inevitable. The issue is whether it will be collectively managed or whether it will be imposed by authoritarian means when it is already too late. Quite what forms this collective management should take is again an open question, one that can only be resolved practically and experimentally. The long dark night of the history that has to be grasped, the long dark night of the end of history has to be grasped as an enormous opportunity. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect. The tiniest event can tear a hole in the gray curtain of reaction, which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. And so at this point, you'll be asking me what my alternatives are. And this topic is, of course, one that could expand into several talks itself. Here are just a few pieces of reading material that I'd recommend. And so I wanted to dedicate this talk to two great minds that are sadly no longer with us. And yeah, and thanks for listening. And I look forward to exploring these ideas further with you today and in the years to come.
Thank you, Danielle. Okay, so we had one question that came in before anybody ever spoke. So I will read out that question. And I mean, because it was before anybody ever spoke, don't be surprised if it's not exactly related to what you said. Anyway, the question is a nonviolent civil disobedience a good way for concerned members of the public to put pressures on our governments to take climate change seriously? If not, what are some alternative tactics and strategies? And whoever among you wants to take this on, Anders or Danielle. Anders, maybe I'll give you a first chance. And I know it's, as I said, it doesn't directly relate to what you said, but it is related to the bigger issue of systemic changes that are needed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have something?
Yeah, this is basically has nothing to do with my expertise, but I can give like an informed opinion, maybe like that. I think it depends on what the object of the sort of non-violence disruption is. You know, is it just the normal person trying to go from A to B in the morning via public transport that cannot go because of a demonstration? We've seen that in the UK with the Extinction Rebellion that had kind of mixed results. Or are we much more directly targeting the sort of problems as we see them, rather than just largely disrupting everybody's lives? That would be like a short answer.
It's been brought to my attention that the question asker, which is Chris Majewski, has his hand up as well. So I'm going to give him the opportunity in case he, Chris, are you wanting to expand on your question? You can unmute yourself and expand or whatever it is.
Thanks, Amy. Yeah, no, actually my live question is a lot less open-ended. Thanks for answering that, Anlish. So basically, my question right now is just a request for clarification, because both presenters used the word overshoot. And I think in the case of Daniel, that meant overshooting the targets that scientists tell us we need to meet. So it's a bad thing. And I just want to ask, Anders, when you say overshoot, are you saying the same thing or are you saying the opposite?
The same thing. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that was it.
Okay. So then I guess we'll go to Danielle and give you a chance to answer the more open-ended question.
Sure, yeah. I think that nonviolent direct action and other forms of civil disobedience are definitely a very important part of provoking social change. And I think the historical precedences there are very strong. And whether you subscribe to nonviolence, explicit nonviolence, or more ambiguous acts of provocation or organizing that don't necessarily, hold to nonviolence, I think that both are very important and complementary, of course, to non-direct forms of opposition, like the more conventional writing your MP or participating in party politics. I think the diversity of tactics is very important, and social change usually only comes about when people are pushing in all these avenues. I think the civil rights movement, of course, is one of the best examples of this, and how you had a huge host of actors with different strategies, and how in the end they seem to be from a historical perspective, all very complementary. You have someone like Malcolm X making Martin Luther King Jr. much more palatable because his ambiguity towards violence and self-defense made this nonviolence, although very, very disruptive, form of protest much more palatable to the liberal white American, and did a lot of good. So yeah, I think despite the disruption is very important. The disruption of something like the 2012 Maple Spring, Printemps Arabe, is something that has yielded gains that have people have tried to take away under neoliberalism, but they're gains that were very important, and they built a movement that's still around in some part, in some form or another, that can be revived. So I think, yeah, very, very important strategy.
Okay, so we have Q&A questions, and then we have another person with their hand up. So I'm going to go between the two. And first, so since I just did a hand up, I'm going to go to the questions in the Q&A. The first one here is anonymous attendee. For Danielle, do you consider decoupling from fossil fuels to be a possibility? If not, why not?
I don't know if it's a matter of decoupling more than the rate of decoupling and the energy and the energy quality of fuels as we transition. So it is definitely possible to transition to a energy system that doesn't use fossil fuels, but along the way we're going to emit a lot of fossil fuels, and how we transition will affect will affect the amount of emissions and whether we can stay below 1.5 or 2 degrees. And so it's and so while it's easier, let's say, to decouple energy production from fossil fuels compared to other things like material inputs and other forms of pollution, it's not I think it's really about how fast we can do it and what we're willing to change other than technology in order to make it work.
Thank you. I'm going to do another one from the Q&A to make sure we get something for Anders. So we've got, actually, it's a 3-part question. This is again anonymous attendee. First part is, do you think that companies use emission targets as a marketing strategy to promote their brands? Part 2, how could the general public monitor whether those targets were actually achieved? And part 3, do you consider overconsumption and massive industrial outputs to be an actual problem rather than economic growth?
Thank you, anonymous attendee. So for sure, companies are using part of the motivation for setting a science-based target is to be able to advertise it to your stakeholder, to sort of position yourself as a climate leader. There's no doubt about that. That's how companies think as well. They have to have some sort of reward in order to do something voluntarily, usually. And so that links to sort of the second question about monitoring whether targets are actually achieved, which is a very good question. And I realized I should have said something more about that in my presentation. So because the practice of setting science-based targets is fairly young, until recently, there hasn't been much research into how companies are progressing against their targets, simply because not enough time have passed since the baseline year. But now, the first couple of months of this year, already two studies came out that were looking for each company that have had a target for a couple of years. They compared the emission trajectory of the company after it had set the target with the target. And actually the results were rather good overall, especially for scope 1 and 2 emissions. They were much less good for scope 3 emissions. And that probably tells you something about how difficult it is for a company to really influence its suppliers and customers, etc., to reduce emissions in those parts of the value chain. And I know also that the Science Based Target Initiative is working on a standard for how companies should report against their targets. So it can be done in a kind of standardized, hopefully harmonized and transparent way. But this is where we also need, I think, civil society and academia to pressure initiatives like that to be even more transparent than they maybe would be at the outset. For the first question, yeah, of course, if it depends on the type of growth. If you have just economic growth and it's all caused by masseuse, people massaging each other and charging high rates for that, people cutting each other's hair. If this is where all the growth is happening, then it's not all that bad because there's not much of a material growth associated with it. But this is probably not where reality is. Sorry if I'm not using the word reality the way Daniel was hinting at. But your third question kind of links to the question that both me and Daniel were sort of asking openly, whether we really can continue the sort of historic trends in output, economic output, and physical output, while also decarbonizing the economy.
I just want to add a footnote, if possible.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
The question of whether it's about limiting production or consumption is also a tricky one, because even if you were to expand, only services that themselves aren't really materially intensive, like massages or other kinds of nice things that people like, but that don't necessarily have a big on-site impact, you're still providing a lot of income. And if people that get this income then use it to consume the same way that the average person does, masseuses don't just spend it on masseuses, or software engineers don't just use all their income to buy software, but they also eat and have a house and go traveling, then the result will be the same. And actually we have research to show this. There's a paper in Environmental Research Letters called The Limits of the Service Sector, or Transition, something along those lines, and I could share that to show that it doesn't really matter if you increase low impact services if people continue to consume the same things and they use their income to buy these things.
Thank you, Daniel, for that addition. Now I'm going to go over to the hands up, because we have somebody with hands up. It's Corey Lesk. If you can unmute yourself, you can speak. Corey, are you there?
Perhaps it was a hand raised by mistake. We can move on.
Okay, so we're going to go back over to the Q&A then. So we have a couple of things from Jochen Jaeger. So I'm going to ask both of them because it's two from the same person. So the first comment question is, very good presentation. So, to both of you. When and where do you expect we will see signs of collapse first? That's his first question. And the second, another question I would like to ask, what do you see as the role of universities in this difficult situation? So who would like to take that one on first? So signs of collapse first, and what's the role of the universities? Danielle, you were second last time. Do you want to be first this time?
So yeah, these are, have anything as far as collapse or whatever your favorite word for some sort of breakdown of things as they are today is I'm not really sure. It's I think that we're already in a lot of ways seeing signs of collapse, and it's a matter of collapse for who. There are a lot of places right now that are suffering things that people in the affluent world would never be able to dream of having to deal with on a daily basis. So no one really cares here to the extent that it doesn't really occupy their thoughts on a daily basis or at all. And so in a very real sense, the world is breaking down, and a lot of it due to climate crisis. And when will this actually become so pronounced that it affects how we live in the wealthier world? It could, it's anyone's guess, but I think that the small things that people complain about, like increases in their fuel costs and their grocery bills, will definitely give way to something a bit more dramatic. And but whether it means that there's going to be a full breakdown of society everywhere, or that we're going to just become more closed off and it's going to become even more of a two-tier global economy, that waits to be seen. And yeah, I don't really want to speculate right now on that because it's not really, I don't know if it's helpful. And as far as universities go, I don't know, I guess there's lots of smaller scale things and gestures that people can do at their universities, from divestment campaigns from fossil fuels, and from trying to get alternative forms of governance and democracy into the workplace, and reducing this kind of taxing bureaucracy and auditing culture, which is a big fight that Mark Fisher talked a lot about in Capitalist Realism. So then there's definitely a lot of good fights to be taken up at the university level. Also unions, graduate school unions. But Corey, who has tried to ask a question before, is an organizer of Concordia of Columbia University in New York's graduate student union, and they've had some hard-won gains made very recently. So there's lots of avenues for change and action to be had at the university.
Thank you, Daniel. Anders, would you like to put in something?
No, I don't really have much clever things to add.
Okay, so I see there's a question that's in the chat, but I do have also some back here in the Q&A. So I'm going to do another from Q&A and then go to the one that's in chat. So the next one up in the Q&A is from Valentine Lucet, I'm not sure. What is the relevance of degrowth in that context, and how credible are degrowth alternatives, or is the degrowth alternative perhaps? Have people elaborated transition scenarios maybe for a degrowth economy? I think there's some words being dropped in the question, but I think it's probably for a degrowth economy. This time I'll go to Anders first, if you have something to say about this one.
Well, it's a big question for sure. I think there's, if you look at the Paris Agreement and also more broadly planetary boundaries that include other issues than climate change, such as land use and nutrient enrichment and water use and other things, then there are some really interesting simulations trying to understand how we can, as a global society, develop within planetary boundaries, but at the same time sort of meet basic needs, and also a bit more than basic needs for everybody on the planet. And that usually involves, if not degrowth, then at least radical redistribution of wealth. So on the research side, I think there's no lack of studies, but whether they are politically appealing, that's maybe more a question to Daniel.
Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of work and tons of stuff that's specifically challenging the mainstream right now. A lot of it comes from degrowth, and for example, there's the one model on the left of the four transitions that I showed you in my slides is the low energy demand pathway, which isn't explicitly a degrowth model, but it's growth agnostic. It doesn't actually prescribe growth. There's one model that I know of that actually has a degrowth scenario for a global energy transition. It's the Euro Green model, and there's a paper in Nature Sustainability about that. And so yeah, there are smaller studies. So for Canada, for example, Peter, Victor, and Tim Jackson have a study on how Canada can transition without growth and how this will actually benefit Canadians. And they have a low growth scenario and a degrowth scenario that explicitly looks at what the accompanying policies would be to ensure that the transition was actually not jarring, didn't cause other kinds of problems that come as a consequence of transitioning to a low growth or contracting economy. So there's tons and tons of scholarship from less in the modeling community and just in the general community, theoretical and other kinds of hard policy communities doing degrowth scholarship. So, I'm sorry, what was the other part of the question?
Oh, hold on a second. It's gone now to the area. Let's see.
How credible is it? I think was the other part.
Have people elaborated transition scenarios, and is the relevance of degrowth, how credible is the degrowth alternative? Yes.
I mean, so I guess, I answered the second part, but the how credible part is, of course, what my talk was kind of about. It's really a matter of choice, is what the argument that needs to be made is, and things that are deemed incredible are of course incredible by this kind of tautological assertion that things have to be the way they are because that's how things are. But revolutions and big changes in paradigm don't they don't happen by themselves, but they take people by surprise. And so if there was a concerted effort and a collective decision to try something else and to try things that are now seen to be politically unfeasible, then and the alternatives themselves are indeed technically credible. Then there's a discussion over how much, how you'd have to tweak certain things, or maybe this actually wouldn't work in practice, but a lot of them do work in practice. But the real question remains about the actual political credibility, which of course, like I said, is something that could be changed with the will.
Okay, we have such a lively set of questions and very diverse questions that are still here. We are unfortunately running out of time. It's hard to choose amongst them. I think the next one in the anonymous attendee one is very specific to Anders. Maybe you could respond, like type an answer to that one. We have two very open ones, and so I'm going to read out both of them and give the two of you a chance to answer the one that you feel like you have the most comments on. They're both about kind of contemporary issues, but they go in different directions. So one is from Michael Rawlings, who is asking about COVID-19. So do you think the speed and scope at which the economic and social order was revised under COVID-19 has helped undermine the perceived inevitability of the current economic system in the public eye? So that's one. We're in this situation where we have had some shocks and things have changed. Is it helpful? The other one, it's quite a different question, but it's again sort of thinking about current situation or just ongoing situation. This is another anonymous attendee. Or maybe it's the same one, who knows? Maybe it's the same anonymous attendee has written all these questions, who knows? Anyway, in addition to addressing issues of economic class, would you say that it is also important to address how climate change and environmental degradation impact other marginalized communities, specifically in the context of Canada and Indigenous communities who have lived sustainably on this land for centuries before settler colonialism? So you have a choice, our two panelists. Would you like to speak about changes under COVID, or do you want to speak about marginalized communities? And I forget who I gave the first opportunity to answer last time. So who among you would like to take a stab at this first? Okay, Andrews?
Yeah, well, I can try to answer the first question. I guess it doesn't require a PhD to see that there's definitely a lot of questions in the air now after COVID-19 that seem to be more of there is no alternative kind of pathway before. Like if you look at the bill that was just passed in the US for stimuli and for checks to individuals and all the initiatives involved around support for childcare and other things. This is something that would have been unthinkable, I think, for just 2 years ago. So yeah, I definitely see a sort of window of opportunity opening because of COVID. But then it becomes a game of framing if we can, because there are also people that would like the status quo not to change and would like us to keep using fossil fuels, etc. There's a really strong lobby behind that, and for sure they will talk about the problem of debt and the problem of we cannot afford all these investments, and we have to go with the true and tested things. So that's gonna be, and you shouldn't introduce more taxes. No, the American people or the Canadian people or whatever don't need another tax now that they're struggling so much. So there's a lot around framing that I think that's where there's gonna be a bit of a war.
Thank you. Danielle, which one would you like to tackle?
I'll just try to add a footnote and address the second question. But I think that I had a COVID hook in my talk, but it got cut when I was trying to make an abridged version for the this is a new talk, and it was very long. Apologies for dragging you through a first go. But the code, of course, the pandemic is. At first, it was a huge opportunity, and people were very, very optimistic that this would be like a huge wake up call, and it's definitely a real. As it's a huge challenge to the social economic order, political economic order as it is, and I think that it still presents a very good opportunity, and it's a great piece of evidence, and it really will be left up to how people seize the opportunity. But yeah, I think that, like Anas was saying, with a lot of things that were part of this business ontology of how conservatives using this. Now conservatives can't even fight a lot of these policies that they were so allergic to. And topically, the $1.9 trillion package that was just passed in the States, even no Republican voted for it, and now they're all singing its praises and trying to take credit for it because they've seen how popular it is in the public. So the public is ahead. It's the leadership that's lagging behind, and the interests of capital and fossil fuels that are lagging behind. So public opinion is way, way, way ahead, and the pandemic has helped a lot. So yeah, it's a matter of how to channel that properly. As for the second question of class versus identity, I think that that it's very contextual, and in Canada, this is a problem that's come to light, and there's been a lot of work being done on it, and there's probably the majority of it still lies ahead of us. But I don't see them as two different fights. I see them as pretty much the same fight. That it's a mistake to look at class and as marginalization as two different dimensions. So what was the right end of the question was, would you say it is also important to address how climate change and marginalized communities? Yeah, I just think that there will be a specific approach, and bringing Indigenous voices into how Canada recreates itself for the 21st century and how it addresses the climate crisis. That's going to actually underpin the success of an energy transition, and I think all the fights for sovereignty and transfer of power back to Indigenous peoples could go hand in hand with a very much more enlightened form of stewardship that Indigenous peoples have at their disposal. Not to I'm not an expert on this, but I think that there's a lot of promise there to combine these approaches.
I see that the question that I had suggested that Andrews take on by typing a response, you want to respond. Can you do it very, very quickly, because we have
well, it was actually a mistake. I pushed the wrong button, but I can try anyways. And it was not from my presentation, but I know a lot about that chart. So in short, all of the pathways that Daniel showed involves a certain amount of renewable energy that is rolled out just at different paces. And so those that are where the rollout of renewable energies happens a bit slow has to compensate by negative emissions. So it's not that negative emission is the only assumed technology going into this future vision. There's also quite a bit of renewable energy, but just not as much as that would be required to have, not relying on those negative emission technologies.
Yeah. Okay. So we have run over, which is a sign of how vigorous and exciting the topic is, and your presentations have been very stimulating. So thank you very much. I see Anna has showed back up to wrap up things for us and to tell us about how we can access this later, I think. So Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks for doing that moderation work, Daniel and Anders. It was such great fun listening to you and hearing this engagement towards the end as well. Thank you for your time. I see that the sun is taking over your space, Daniel. So I think that's signaling to all of us that we should just try to get outside and get a few minutes of sunshine today. We appreciate all of you in the audience as well who joined us here today. I did put a link in the chat of where the video will be available. I put a link to the schedule of events for the rest of the week. Please join us at any time. A great big thank you to Rebecca Titler, who's here with us today, who made today and every day this week happen. So we are very grateful to be a part of it. Once again, via virtual Force Space. We look forward to seeing you first thing tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. And our last talk tomorrow is at 4 p.m. So full day of events. We'll see you then, everybody. And once again, thank you both today for your excellent presentations. Really appreciated it.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Have a nice day, guys.
See you all soon. Bye.
Bye.